Okaloosa County man who murdered his wife and 2 young children 31 years ago is dead.
After 29 years on death row, Edward J. Zakruski was executed in Florida on July 31st, 2025. We will talk about his last meals, last words, and the final visits before his execution. But his final words weren't remorseful. They were sarcastic. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible," he said, his voice steady. Then, as if auditioning for death, he began reciting Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. But he never made it to the end. The drugs were already kicking in. At 6:13 p.m., Edward Zakruski, once a decorated technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, a father, a husband, was pronounced dead. The man who once swore to protect his family had slaughtered them in their own bathroom. The murders happened on June 9, 1994, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Mary, Florida. Edward seemed like the model military man, clean-cut, soft-spoken, raising 2 children with his wife Sylvia. But beneath that calm exterior was a man cracking under pressure. He had told a neighbor more than once, "If she ever leaves me, I'll kill her. I'll kill them all." And that's exactly what he did. What drove him to take a crowbar, a rope, and a machete to his own family? How did he evade capture for months, vanish into a Hawaiian religious cult, and still manage to live with himself for nearly 30 decades behind bars? This is the full story of Edward Zakruski. The murders, the manhunt, the trial, the long wait for justice, and the cold clinical execution that ended it all. June 9th, 1994 began like any other day for Edward Zakruski. He reported for duty at the Eglin Air Force Base, where he worked in a highly technical role, wearing his crisp uniform and blending in with the military routine. But that afternoon, he got a phone call that cracked his carefully controlled world. His son, 7-year-old Edward III, nicknamed Kim, called to say that Sylvia had made a decision. She wanted a divorce. She was taking the kids. She was leaving. Edward didn't yell, he didn't scream. Instead, he quietly walked off base, drove to a hardware store, and purchased a machete, an actual machete. Then he calmly returned to base and finished his shift, hiding the weapon in the trunk like a man with nothing left to lose. That evening, he got home before Sylvia and the kids. He laid out his tools like a surgeon prepping for an operation, a crowbar, a rope, and the machete, all within reach. Then he waited. Sylvia walked in, tired from her shift. She probably thought the evening would be quiet, just dinner, a bath for the kids, maybe a little TV. She didn't see Edward coming. He struck her twice in the head with the crowbar. She collapsed, but was still breathing, so Edward dragged her into the bedroom and strangled her with a rope. Methodical, silent, vicious. But he wasn't done. He went into the bathroom and called out to his son, "Come brush your teeth." Kim walked in, trusting his father, like always. Edward raised the machete and struck. Kim tried to shield himself. His wrist was sliced deeply, but Edward kept swinging, over and over, until Kim lay dead on the floor. Then he called for his daughter. 5-year-old Anna walked in with no fear. She still saw her dad as a hero, but just like her brother, she was struck down. She tried to fight back. Cuts on her hands and arms proved that, but there was no escaping her father's rage. In the end, all 3, his wife, his son, his daughter, were dead. He arranged their bodies side by side in the bathroom. Then, without remorse, he left. After the murders, Edward didn't panic. He cleaned up, packed a bag, and drove to Orlando. From there, he boarded a flight to Hawaii under a false identity, Michael Green. In Hawaii, he joined a secluded religious commune tucked deep into the hills. He lived in a hand-built shack, worked for food, and blended in perfectly. He attended services, kept quiet, and earned a reputation as a peaceful, reclusive man. No one suspected what he'd done. Back in Florida, things were beginning to unravel. Edward never returned to the Air Force Base. After missing multiple days, the military listed him as AWOL, but when deputies arrived at the Zakruski home for a welfare check, they found a horror scene. Blood soaked the bathroom. The bodies of Sylvia, Kim, and Anna lay arranged side by side, and Edward was gone. A manhunt began. His face went out across the country. For 4 months, there was nothing, not a single sighting. Then came October 15th, 1994. Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment featuring Edward's photo and story. It only took a few hours for the truth to catch up. Members of the commune watched the show and saw someone they knew. One of them looked at Edward and said, "Brother Michael, that looks a lot like you." He didn't respond. He just stood up and walked back to his shack. There, he wrote a short note, "I'm sorry." 9 days later, he walked into a police station and turned himself in. He had nowhere left to run. Edward was extradited back to Florida. In March 1996, he stood in court and confessed to the murders. His face was calm. His voice never cracked. There was no trial to prove guilt. It was now a sentencing phase. Would he get life in prison or death? Edward James Zakrzewski II was born on January 31st, 1965, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He joined the U.S. Air Force in his early 20s, eventually rising to the rank of technical sergeant. During a posting in Montana in 1986, he met a young South Korean woman named Im Poon. She would later adopt the American name Sylvia. Their connection was quick and life-altering. By the time Sylvia was pregnant, the two decided to marry. That union would bind them together across countries and continents, from Montana to a 3-year tour in South Korea, where they lived between 1989 and 1992. Their son, Edward Kim Zakrzewski III, was born in 1987, followed by their daughter Anna in 1989. But while Edward's career grew stable, Sylvia's world seemed to narrow. As a Korean woman raising biracial children in the shadow of a rigid military culture, she often felt isolated and overwhelmed. By the time the family relocated to Mary Esther, Florida in 1992, tensions had begun to unravel their marriage. Sylvia was increasingly unhappy, and Edward was described as cold, controlling, and emotionally distant. According to court records, he grew paranoid that Sylvia would leave him and take the children back to South Korea. He reportedly confided to neighbors, "If she leaves me, I'll kill them all." On June 9th, 1994, everything came to a head. That morning, while Edward was at work at Eglin Air Force Base, he received a phone call from his son, Kim. The boy innocently told Edward what he had feared most. Sylvia was preparing to leave him. During his lunch break, Edward left base, bought a machete, and calmly returned to finish the day. That evening, he arrived home before his family, stashed the weapon, and waited. That prosecutors would later argue it showed a level of premeditated cruelty rarely seen in American courts. A family once defined by duty and quiet struggle was destroyed by a single horrific choice. The prosecution described a scene of horror. They told the jury how Edward had ambushed Sylvia from behind, how he had called his children in one by one, using their trust against them. They described Anna, just 5 years old, stepping into the bathroom and seeing her brother's blood. They said the murders were deliberate, calculated, inhumane, not acts of rage, but a cold, methodical plan. They pushed for the death penalty on all 3 counts. But Edward's lawyers painted a different picture. They said he was a broken man, emotionally crushed, psychologically frayed. They told the court how Sylvia had threatened to take the kids back to South Korea, where she once faced discrimination and hardship. Edward, they claimed, believed he was saving his children from a life of rejection, a sick logic, but one he seemed to truly believe. The jury couldn't agree on everything. They voted 7-5 for death in Sylvia's case, 7-5 again for Kim. But when it came to Anna, the youngest, they were tied, 6 for life, 6 for death. But the judge didn't hesitate. He overrode the jury's indecision. He said, "The evidence shows that Anna saw what was coming. She suffered. Her final moments were filled with fear." And with that, Edward was sentenced to death 3 times. Zakruski was sent to Florida's death row, where he would remain for the next 29 years. Locked in a 6 by 9 foot cell 23 hours a day. He read. He filed motions. He waited. He challenged his sentence repeatedly, arguing the jury wasn't unanimous, that his rights were violated, that his mental state hadn't been considered. For a moment in 2017, he saw hope. Florida had just changed its law. A death sentence now required a unanimous jury. Edward's lawyers argued that he would never have received the death penalty under today's rules, but the courts disagreed. The law couldn't be applied retroactively. His sentence stood. Appeal after appeal failed. By 2018, the Florida Supreme Court dismissed his last major petition. For years, his case sat dormant, but in June 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. The countdown was now official. His execution date, July 31st, 2025. Edward woke up early on his final day, around 5 a.m. There were no last-minute visitors. He declined a spiritual advisor. He didn't request a Bible. His final meal was large but ordinary: fried pork chops, potatoes, bacon, onions, toast, root beer, a slice of pie, ice cream, and coffee. At 6 p.m., the witnesses were escorted into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Zakruski was already strapped to the gurney, covered by a white sheet. 14 people watched: reporters, prison staff, state witnesses. When asked if he had final words, Edward gave none of the usual remorse or apologies. Instead, he looked straight ahead and said, "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible. I have no complaints." Then he began reciting lines from Robert Frost. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep." His voice trailed off. At 6:04 p.m., the lethal cocktail entered his veins. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, then slowed. By 6:12, he was still, and at 6:13, he was declared dead. Edward Zakruski was 60 years old. He left behind no statement, no note, and no trace of who he used to be, except for the 3 graves in Florida he created with his own hands.